Good afternoon and welcome into the Takeup. Today we have episode 187, Digitizers and Difficulties, Examples from the Archive. Greetings, everybody. Welcome in to the Takeup on this Friday afternoon. Today we're going to talk about some experiences, right? Once again, I've kept up the old wall of shame behind me to make sure that we keep ourselves in the mind of being in that commercial space. This is what I'm talking about today, dealing with customer focused work, the kind of stuff where you're taking in custom work, you're answering the briefs, you are dealing with expectations, you're communicating with people. And why I called it digitizers and difficulties, because we're going to talk about some different kinds of difficulties that people get into today. And I'm just going to share some stories and show some designs. It should be a short and sweet kind of show. It won't be perhaps quite as instructionally heavy as it usually is. I'm going to show you some sequencing and some different things and walk you through some design changes I've had to make over my career. But this is some stuff from some early days in my career, not super early, but quite some time ago now. But yeah, from years back, I decided to select a few pieces from an earlier year where all I was doing was production. So this is kind of one of the last years where I wasn't really teaching. This is before I was teaching as much, mostly related to things that were entirely in that commercial sphere. So it wasn't something where I was quite on that, continuous grind of teaching and making the stuff out for the shows, making the classes, doing the online stuff. The writing started the same year that most of these designs I'm going to show you are from. There'll be some other examples of things that I've done after that. And we're going to talk about things you may have seen before in some of my classes, but I'm actually going to show you some pretty raw files that come from these early days before I was perhaps the embroidery expert everybody thinks I am now. So we're going to talk about that on a pretty frank basis. So discussing some of the clients, what went wrong, what went right, the things that we had to deal with, and just walking through it. So we can talk about what it's like for an in-house digitizer and the kind of things you can run into, the kind of difficulties. So there's going to be some technical stuff. Certainly, we're going to talk about all that different stuff. So it's not just, difficulties in general. I mean, yes, we're going to talk about some of the technical things that happen with digitizers and digitizing. But we're dipping into the archive. We're dipping into the Wayback Machine on some of the things that I've done so that I can talk about design issues as well. So I'm not talking about issues with an embroidery design. I mean issues of design, things that happen to be problematic due to the way the art is designed, perhaps, or how we're putting the embroidery together. A couple of technical things that are running poorly on the machine require you to make 4, 5, 6, 7 revisions to make sure they turn out right because there's issues with things like certainly registration or thread breaks or issues that you might be encountering in a technical sense. And certainly a couple of things I'm going to talk about are interpersonal. And what I mean by that is honestly just communication. When we're dealing with expectations that may or may not be very reasonable, maybe they're not something that can be done and we have to get that communication across. There are times where either because we're not in the right headspace to handle it or because we don't have the right answers in front of us, that the communication breaks down and we have issues with that too. So all of these things are going to be there. But certainly, like I said, we're talking about digitization difficulties. It's the entire realm of what it's like to take in art, do interpretations, put those in front of people, get them on machines and get them produced. And in a realistic way, you're going to find that not all the designs I show you here are the most masterful designs that I've ever done. They may not have the most detail you expect out of me because honestly, not everything calls for it and not every client is looking for it. So really, this is about that kind of work. And that's, once again, one of those design things. Sometimes the brief is to make this simple thing and make it work right now. And that's sometimes what you have to do. But it's all about communication, right? It's communication. It's about art versus expectations. And we're going to get into all of that as we talk about what it is like being a digitizer, what digitizing feels like to do, and the difficulties we can encounter as we do it. But as you guys know, whenever you show up live, I like to kind of reward the people who are showing up live by talking to them and answering questions. If you guys have questions or comments or things you want to kick in, you want to say hi, go ahead. If you're on the replay squad right now and you don't want to live through a couple of minutes of me saying hi to everybody, fast forward. That's the lovely thing about recording. Otherwise, I'm going to talk to people who are live here today. So let's say hi to everybody. We got Cindy King coming in from Texas. Good windy afternoon. Absolutely. Hey, Charles saying he's making it in live. Thank you for being here. Absolutely. Jab Embroidery saying howdy, y'all. Windy spring day in Texas for certain. Absolutely. Windy here too in New Mexico. It was much worse earlier, but a little windy here too. We got Scott from Sunrise Tactical Gear saying hi to everybody. Everybody talking to each other, so I love that. Lisa's coming in from the EM show. So Lisa and Debbie are out there. Lisa Shaw, awesome educator on her own, doing her own classes out there at the Everything Embroidery Market shows, as well as representing in Brilliance for us out there, and Debbie as well in the support staff and representing us out there. So thank you for doing that hard work you're doing out there, guys, and we'll be pulling for you on the home front. But embroidery, sublimation, and vinyl trade shows, yeah, man, there's lots going on out there, and trust me, we're going to talk about more technology down the road here. There's some new stuff coming that I may want to bring up on the show. We got Ron in saying happy Friday. Happy Friday, Ron. Happy to see you here. Barb's in from North Central Minnesota. Frank, thank you for tuning in from across the pond over in the UK. Love to have you here, sir. Thank you very much. Letty is out of work early. Good to see you here, Letty. Thank you for being here. But yeah, let's get into it, folks. Right? Like I said, it's going to be a short, sweet show. I'm sure I say that, and I never go through that. If you have to leave, you have to leave. But I'm going to talk about some fun stuff, and we're going to get into really just talking about designs in a frank manner. This is Shop Talk. This is you and me. We are digitizers. We deal with embroidery, and we know what's up, and we're going to talk about that together today. Oh, and by the way, you saw one more. James says hi. Hi, James. Happy to have you in as well. So yeah, we got everybody jumping in, and then Ron laughing too. Yeah, this is Shop Talk for digitizers. And Ron will have something to say too. If we've been around this business for a while, you know that some of these difficulties are real, and that these things are things we deal with. So what are we talking about here? First thing is, I'm going to give you something that I taught in one of my classes. I'm going to show a case study, one of the later case studies. Before we get into actually tearing into some of these designs and looking at art and talking about that, I'm going to go over a case study where this whole thing comes together, right? The concept of technical issues, design issues, and communication all came together and worked out pretty well. So let's talk about one that went well. Before we dive into the difficulties, here's one you may have seen me teach in my classes, right? So here's a case study for a company that we call DBD Design. And yes, I'm showing you class materials here. You know, I try and review my class materials, but there's some stuff that overlaps. Here's one that I think is just powerful enough that I teach this one frequently. DBD Designs stands for something that is not necessarily family friendly. It's a don't be a something that starts with D and has 4 letters. That's the name of the design company. They were pretty off the cuff and wild folks. They had a paint splatter kind of graffiti style logo with some 3D foam done in a brush script here on the front. But the front of the hat wasn't really the problem. Their standard design piece, it's interesting here. There's some gradations. There's some textures that are cool. But that didn't really cause me any pause, right? I'm pretty happy with this piece. That looked good. It looks nice. And it worked well even on, we're doing fitted flex fits here, and it looked really good. The thing that was a little more difficult actually had to do with the back of the design. So let's go into it and actually talk about the rest of these design pieces. Like I said, this pretty easy. We're in the realm of things where, yes, there's some technical difficulties with overlapping stuff like that, but the design interpretation of this, the only thing that was difficult for the design interpretation is deciding how to get the interesting textures of this splatter texture back here, how to put a little bit of gradation. We can see there's some accordion fills and some other stuff going on. The difficulty we really had was in the back of the design. So let's get over to the back of the design was supposed to be like. This is the original draft of the cat back art. And so if you've been in this business for any period of time at all, you are certainly understanding exactly what's going on. Immediately, I'm saying, all right, man, I've got a lot of little detail in this piece. It's supposed to be for a vertical layout. We know, what do caps have going for them? Well, we're looking at caps. We all know caps, as the cap that I have on here, as any cap. We have a nice wide area for decoration. You know, we've got, heck, we could go all the way around the temples. And if we go 270-degree cap frames, we can do crazy stuff. But as far as going up into the height, up into the crown, you know that we're really not looking at too much space. I used to like to top out at 60 to 65 millimeters. That's really where I like to be. And it really depends heavily on the hat. On these ones, we had some stretchy flex fits, right? So nothing that was terrible. It was structured in the front, but the back had flex fits. So we're going to have to work on that too. It's going to have some stabilization. But then we have all these tiny details. So let's bring our friend back up to a slightly larger design space. Check this out. So in these tiny details, and I'm going to bring my cursor out so you can see these, just like I was pointing these out in class. We've got these shoe patches. And yes, we've got a design on the shoe patches, right? We have the belt buckle. We have these hands, the facial features. And here's the other thing. This is representing an actual person. Why do I put danger here? Because this is somebody who's related to the company who they know, and it's his attitude, it's this person's look that is important to them. So we talk about communication and we talk about art versus expectations. We have to realize when they're bringing this in, this person is important to the company, and that person being identifiable is a big deal, right? So obviously we have to do something to fix that. So I'm looking at this going, I've got to figure out what's important. So what's important? We want to represent this person. We know they're important. They're a real person that's important to them. But is the shoe patch important? Is that desperate? Is that what they do? Is the belt buckle important? Is any of the way he's dressed important? Is that the real thing, or is it the person? And I took a risk and said, all right, well, what can we do to make this work? I think the best thing we can do is what identifies a person is the face, right? So what's important? It's identify this person. It maintains this kind of laid back character. And then as we were working on this, we're getting into communication. What happens? We start talking to them about what they want in the back, and they decided to add a motto. They decided to add text to the back of this design. So it means that not only are they going to have that front design they already saw, now we're adding a motto. We're adding a company text to the back of this design, meaning that I've also got to get the vertical space in for that. I've got to figure that out. So this one turned into a redesign. This is something where just saying, and this is the problem I have sometimes. I will go to the Facebook group, somebody will ask me questions, and what their primary problem will be, they're looking at this art like this, the way you're seeing it here, and they'll come to me and say, how do I get smaller details? That's what I need. I need to get smaller details. What's the finest thread I can use? How can I make this thing tiny? And you look at this, and though could I render this in some fashion? Absolutely. You guys have seen this before. I've shown you several of these kind of county seals or some of the native tribal seals that are out here. And I'm going to show you one of those today that has a lot going on in it. I have made incredibly tiny faces where I capture something of the face. But looking at this piece, I'm like, there's just, by the time we get this down on the back of a flex fit cap, it's going to be very small. This man's face will be the size of the end of my pinky finger. I'm not going to have a lot of room to make this a recognizable person, and it's not going to be that interesting. Plus, for other people who don't know who this is, it won't be like the funny joke of the guy's wearing a hat that is his own face. You won't be able to tell. You won't necessarily know who this is unless you are very aware of that from being kind of insider on the company. Now, sometimes that inside joke is enough. Sometimes that's what they're looking for. In this case, they wanted it more identifiable. So what are we going to do with that? Well, let's actually get into that. Let's talk about what I actually did. This is what I actually did. In the final piece, we decided more detail on the face. We do it as a bust. That's the part that's the most important. We get this facial expression. This guy has kind of a real interesting facial expression. Very obviously, he's like myself, has some squints for eyes. I know I get accused of that one myself sometimes. I can't open my eyes very wide whatsoever. But he's got himself a really recognizable facial expression. I was able to get some satin stitch in here to get that defined brow line. They had these brows that are pretty heavy. I'm like, all right, I got that defined brow line for it with some light density satin stitches on top of the fills. I carved out the little strands of hair into satin stitches, have some curved fills for the rest of what's going on in the body. You can also see a light satin that makes up the edge and kind of the bridge of the nose here. But because the lips were kind of understated, I did not try and carve those out. I think it would have pushed him out too far. He's got pretty thin lips and this kind of smirk that's going on here. So I just drew those out with some double running stitch. And we added the phrase, as you can tell, don't be a something. I'm going to try and be good about it. But right, they liked it. They liked it. They were happy with it. The thing is, this is not always what's going to happen. I'm not going to, mess around. I will keep this 100 with you. This is not always going to happen. You're not always going to have a customer who you literally chop their art in half and they're happy. So some of the things that can happen when we talk about interpersonal problems, it can be that you look at a thing and you show something like this. Now, don't get me wrong. I have had very few people, once I get them to something where I believe I'm getting to what they actually need rather than what they think they need, very few of the companies have come back and said, nope, put it back. I want it this way. Some do. Some companies will come to you and just say, no, make it flatter, less detail, just blow it up, do what you have to do. I want it today. I don't care how it looks. It just has to have the name on it, whatever it is that's important to them. But the second half of that sentence is what you need to think about. It's what's important to them. And that's where we're talking once again about art versus expectations. Don't get me wrong. Plenty of the clients I've dealt with have seen a piece like this and said, I know you can do it. I've seen it done. My last guy did it. Now, don't get me wrong. I've also said to them, bring me the example from the last guy. I can copy anything that somebody else has done. And very frequently they'll bring me a copy. And the one thing always with small text, They will bring me a copy back of the piece they had done previously, where they're like, I know I had this entire text under this particular logo. They bring it back to me, and there's invariably very different font. And almost always, when it's something where I've actually gone to the mat, where I'm like, nope, we're going to have the discussion over this, get probably less friendly than it needs to be, or than I would like it to be. I say, yes, I need to see a sample of the last piece. It's because the previous person had abbreviated words. Very common in some of the stuff I'm talking about is like the word association being abbreviated to ASSN. And yes, that needs that N there for obvious reasons. Very frequently, I've had people who have really long professional titles or divisional titles, depending on what they're working on, have abbreviations that they don't remember are there. The thing is, they're filling it in their minds all the time. So when they bring it to me, sometimes I'm like, all right, you want it at that size? Absolutely. You said your last guy can do it. Please give me a sample. Even if you can just take me a picture with your phone and zip it over to me. Let me see what that sample's like. I can make anything someone else can make. And I have not been wrong so far about somebody just saying having done something when I've gone to the mat for it. If it's within the realm of possibility, I will push the line if someone is desperate for it. However, when we're coming to things that I really know just won't work, they are physically not going to work correctly, and I've gone to that line and said, hey, let me see that sample. Almost always there's some sort of mitigation that's done like this. Now, this is extreme. This is an extreme form of mitigation. We are redesigning things. I'm not going to lie. This is a customer who is a creative customer. They're a design house, so you have to think about it that way. As you know, DBD, this is a design place, right? DBD Design, they've got some creative, some creative chops. They know what they're doing. They're not going to freak out quite the same way that maybe your local plumber might if you're messing with their logo. However, I will say this, as we're getting into all this stuff about our difficulties and about communication issues and expectations, realizing that having a sample like this, hey, and I've always told people, you want to show my samples, as long as you're clear that it's my sample, I don't care if you show my samples to your customer. If it helps you illustrate a point, show the samples. I mean, show them a sample of what potential changes can be like, or what you're thinking. Be very clear with them and communicate. And as long as you're upfront and you're working with a customer that has the headspace for that. Now, I absolutely, if you got somebody who's on a 24-hour turnaround and they're paying a lot of money for it and they want what they want, try as hard as you can and give them what they want, certainly. But if you're having someone who wants to have that interaction, who's having that design discussion with you, being very upfront and talking about it can really net you quite a lot of good. Sometimes what you end up with is a part that's better than the original, or at least that fulfills the brief, right? That fulfills the questions and the needs of the customer better than what they previously might have done. So that's the thing I wanted to show with that. Like, I just wanted to make it clear that, not all the time is it going to be that you can do that, but there are successful times where you ask for those changes. But it is something that's very common, right? Very common thing to deal with is that someone is bringing you something that technically is not going to work. So it's not, technical problems aren't always about the fact like the machine is not running correctly, or we're not getting good registration between the colors. We're not having that run correctly, or the text looks a little rough, whatever it may be. Sometimes technical problems are with your knowledge of embroidery, seeing a piece of art, knowing the size someone wants it, the desired finish size, knowing what it's going on, either as far as how the fabric's going to run or what size it's going to run at, and realizing, hey, this is just not going to work the way you want it to, not without some alterations or some problems. So these are things we just have to deal with. And honestly, I think one of the best things we can do as digitizers is sharpen this tool right here, communication. If you can sharpen the tool of communication, if you can keep yourself out of the realm of, driving yourself into a fight, or getting unhappy or upset or otherwise heated up over someone challenging something that you're doing, that is something you should do. By all means, learn what I like to call a kind of a business casual version of communication, where it's like, you don't have to be fully ameliorating them for everything they do. You don't have to take a bunch of blame, but you don't also yell, scream, fight, or flee. You go into this thing understanding you can be helpful, nice enough, firm when something is a firm boundary, and communicate, but always lead with the concept that I'm trying to understand this person across from me, so that with the best interpretation of what they said, I'm going to get to some information that's going to help us both get where we want to go. We got to care a little bit about what they want and need, and I think it's worthwhile to think about. But suffice it to say, it's a good example to say, there are things that maybe don't always work that well. But we can do what I've said in these slides too, is that you turn a weakness into a strength. We couldn't deliver on the original specs with that vertical nature of the cap embroidery, but if we look at it, we clearly explain what we can do and we address customer concerns. So instead of just saying this is what we can't do and then waiting for the customer to come back to you with edits or repairs or to, kowtow to whatever thing we told them they need to change, we should also be solutions providers. It's what I've always said. Be a consultant, not a commodity. When you see something that's just not going to work, instead of laughing in someone's face at something they potentially designed themselves or had designed that they love that means something to them and saying, man, that's not going to happen. That attitude doesn't feel good for a lot of people. And the best concept we can come up with is to say, hey, there's some technical issues with what you want here. I don't think it's going to work to the best ability for your piece. It's not really going to work towards your best interest for us to force this piece at this size. However, here's some examples of stuff that I've done, or here are some things I think we could do to make a really awesome hat or a really great shirt or a really fantastic jacket back. If you have some concepts in your mind, if you've looked at enough embroidery, we talked about analysis last week. Part of that is just absorbing more embroidery. If you've looked at enough examples, you've got some samples under your belt, you've got some concepts, some ideas, you've thought about this process, you're much more likely to have a solution that's going to get you to a better answer overall. So I'll keep hammering on that as we go through this. Is that's really instead of a no, you want a how about? You know what I mean? Instead of that's not going to work, you want to say, here's what I would do. If this were my piece, here's what I would do. The most powerful phrase in the industry. Like I said, we now have something that's clearly better suited for the caps and we get more impressive embroidery. And I think that's just something we should think about. What's the best thing we can do to answer their needs, but to have better embroidery, to have something that works better for what we're trying to do? So like I said, we got a couple of those, and I've got some examples that are all on my thumbnail here. We've got some pieces from Two Fult's Tavern over here. I've got some pieces from Pueblo of Acoma that I'm going to talk about real quickly. I got a jacket back from a Bug Stop, and we're going to talk about these three and a couple other pieces just to give you a little more concept of some things that caused me some difficulties and why, and give you more examples of what I'm talking about here. But these are all different kinds of difficulties. It's just stuff from the archive that I think might be interesting and might illustrate a couple points for you. Let's see, we've got a couple of comments here, so I'm going to go ahead and grab a comment before we get in here. First, Jab says, LOL, nice. Yeah, no, right. The phrasing on the hat is pretty nice, right? Phrasing people, I don't know. But hey, I try and keep it family friendly here, even though I would usually, I curse a little more in person. So if you've seen me in person, I do try and keep it down, but I do curse a little more in person. Ron says, ran into this problem with text under a logo this week. Text was under 5 millimeters, had to do it in running stitch, tried to give another concept, no go, did what I could, haven't heard back. This is just the wages of being a digitizer in the world sometimes. Text is going to be one of the biggest things we fight with, but it is really, really difficult, right? It is just something that is difficult to work with. Got one quick question from Trudy Johnson. A little off topic. We're talking about the shop, so we'll talk about it here. I just had someone ask if I can embroider on a leather hat. How will that turn out? Any recommendations? People will tell you all sorts of things about how to run on leather. It depends very highly on the leather itself and how it's constructed. If you have a constructed leather hat that has like a big seam in the middle of it, that makes me a little nervous. If your leather's really soft, you might not have too much trouble. The thing to worry about is if the leather is very soft or if it tears easily. What you should remember about anything that's like leather is that a hole in leather is a hole forever, and they are visible. So punching big holes, big needles can keep you from having quite so much drag on the thread sometimes, but they also leave large holes and they're visible. I have found in my career that softer glove leathers are a little easier to work with in some respects. People will always warn you about punching a hole out of leather. A constructed leather item that is on a fabric style backing is not usually going to punch a big hole out, but watch your densities. And by all means, if anyone tells you to use a leather needle, and what I mean by a leather needle is one that's made for sewing leather, and a needle for sewing leather is a wedge pointed needle that's very sharp. It's not for embroidery. Pardon me, guys. It's not for embroidery, and a wedge needle like that, that's essentially a bladed needle, will absolutely cut through the rest of the embroidery if you embroider over the top of it. So you're doing some pieces. You've got a fair amount of embroidery down. You've got you've got a big filled area and you start running satin stitch text over it with a leather type needle, it's going to fray that thread and look horrible. And then you're punching out holes because those things are really made for seams. They're not made for embroidery. So um, my experience has been, if the leather's nice and soft, most standard needle recommendations are great. I drop my densities a little bit. I use structural underlay and I just keep it light. Keep it a little bit light. Watch your edge quality. It can be kind of difficult to get great edge quality on leather depending on how you're doing it. Now, what I'm going to say is um, it's just something that you need to work on. It's just something that's better to uh, do some sampling on if you've never done it before. If you can get some leather that's comparable, uh, old jacket from from a thrift store, a swatch of leather from your local leather company. That's what I had to do when I first started working on it. I just did not love working on that leather. But yeah, it's just one of those things. You will see people recommend every kind of needle from, they'll say a ball point makes a big round hole and it's better to, and it causes less drag. They'll say a thicker needle will make that work better. They'll say a thinner needle will work better. My experience has been fairly normal size needles. So 75 lens were fine. I was using 40 weight thread. It was fine. It was a little grabby. So you have to watch out if you're getting a lot of extra, depending on the leather you're working on and depending on the item you're working on, you're getting a lot of extra drag and extra friction. You might want to go ahead and put some non-staining silicone on your needles, but you got to be careful that doesn't leak into the leather. Don't do it really hard. I usually use a standard point. I'm using an RG most of the time, kind of an in-between point, but you can use a nice sharp point. Just a round regular point is great for leather. I've done that before. A sharp point works great. Like I said, people will constantly tell you all these different things. The best thing you can do is run a sample with a known good design on leather that's similar to what you're going to work on. But most definitely the one thing I've said not to do, and I have tried it because I got so many people swearing up and down that a leather sewing style needle was for this. You absolutely don't do that. Standard embroidery needle is the way to go. RG point, so sharp, or a transitional balls are pretty nice. I mean, an RG really isn't even much of a ball point. It's just barely rounded off. Works really good. And I've had no problems with it. It was more about the leather itself. The one time I had problems, I had this extremely thin leather that was also brittle. It was very much like cardstock, and I had to treat it like cardstock. Put very few holes in it. Don't put a ton of lined up edges so that I'm perforating on it, because the leather itself, it was like beef jerky. It was like super dry natural beef jerky. It was like cardstock. It did not act like a fabric, but that's probably not the case with the leather cap. It's about the leather you're working on. Soft leather is going to be good. And Doug says RG is considered a semi-sharp. Yeah, the RG, it's one of those kind of styles. It's not a full sharp needle, and it's definitely not a full ball point. I use them for a lot of stuff. As a transitional needle, I've used RG points on almost everything and found that it's okay. It's one of those things where if you end up with a crazy coarse garment where you got really thick wales in it, or you got just really coarse like duck or canvas, that you might be happier with an R with a fully sharp needle. But most stuff, RG just kind of chews right through it. Doesn't do too bad. Doesn't have a problem. Real fine knits, things you absolutely don't want to split, then you might go out to a ballpoint. You'd be a little happier. But yeah, Doug says he does a lot of leather embroidery and saying RRG. So yeah, listen to Doug. Doug does more than I have, certainly, and Barbara agrees. So like I said, and Doug says one of two recommended for leather. Yeah, I think the sharp is the right way. I'm just saying, if you go out there and do a survey, you'll find people who use everything and swear up and down different things do different jobs. Same thing with 3D foam, by the way. I've had people recommend every manner of needle for 3D foam. I found that it just was not as critical as the digitizing for 3D foam. But leather, similarly, tons of people will tell you you're going to punch a medallion right out of it. Unless you've got some pretty serious densities, I wouldn't be too worried if you're on a soft leather that's pliable. But do keep light. Keep your sensitivity to how many stitches you're putting in an edge. It's just what something to think about. Like I said, if anybody else here has actually had the punch out problem happen, let me know. I have not, but like I said, on the one time I did these leather medallions for somebody, and I did have to drop that density way out because those leather medallions, like, they would crack more than bend. It really is about the quality with leather. Leather is not one thing. I've done work on boots before. Working on boots is not like working on those little medallions, is not like working on soft glove leather. It's just not quite the same. And it may be different depending on how that works for you. But I know not the best answer to say that. But for me, I would start out by hitting the old regular 7511 RGs and give it a shot, and definitely do a little sampling if you can, or order a spare and run all over it if you can. But there we go. So let's get back into it, right? So we were talking about some of the other digitizing difficulties. Hey, that's one of them though. Why do we have difficulties? Because people bring us random garments that don't always work that way. So it is very different. But yeah, for sure. And hey, Doug, good work. Doug says he's a leather worker. I have experience with leather industrial sewing machines. I understand needle points. I'm using 4-stitch density. See, there you go. So like he said, he's using that density. He's using 0.4 or 4 points, I'm assuming. Yeah, so 0.4 stitch density. Yeah, standard densities, standard needle points, not bad. That's what I did too. Like I said, you're going to find random people saying other stuff. I'm going to tell you what I did, and certainly Doug tells you what he did. But I will say, yeah, don't use stuff that's made for cutting. Don't use stuff that's made for other stuff. Don't use random other needles that aren't for embroidery. Just use your standard embroidery needles. And like I said, between that and the only other thing is that if it gets grabby, I have seen people use coated needles, and I have used silicone on my needles if I get an extremely grabby thread, or if I get a ton of friction. Sometimes it's also because I did metallic work on leather. And so old school Mylar metallics that have that the very exposed, twinkly wrapped Mylar on them catch more than other things. And so you're more worried about eye geometry and stuff because of the thread than you are with the leather. But leather and that can be really difficult. And that's some of what I was doing. Anyway, let's go on from there. Let's talk about some other stuff, some other designs. I told you guys we had some other stuff that I was going to show you. And the first one I'm going to talk about is that Two Fools Tavern design. So like I said, it really is something that you have to look at. What does somebody bring you? What are their expectations? And you guys know that for some reason, I've just done a lot of kind of like Celtic stuff, and I've done a fair amount of, I do Viking Age stuff on my own. So there's some interlace, some detail there. But we had a Celtic pub open up many, many years ago. And these folks brought in a piece of art, and I immediately looked at this thing and thought, though it's not as detailed as you might be concerned about with some things, it's fairly flat design, doesn't have a lot of shading. It had a lot of detail. And this is where we kind of have issues with all the above. We're talking about expectations. We're talking about difficulties on the machine. So let's bring that up. Let's talk about this design and look at it. So this is what was brought into me. This is the original design for Two Fools Tavern, right? And what we see here, number one, you can tell, and this is something to think about when you talk to the customer. These are two very different people. We can see that the styles of the people are important. We have hair colors on each of them. We have the hair shape is different. We have different shirts on either of them with patterns in them. We have these fine lines. And also we can see that we've done some scaling or something where some of the lines are extremely fine. They've got these doubled lines inside of these triquetra at the corners. We've got this interlace that goes up and down from the horns that they are blowing on both sides. This thing has also something you would never see if you don't get real tight on it. And don't get me wrong, you're not going to represent all of this, but we've got little curly cues inside of the hat. We have little line details everywhere, curly cues at all the joints, something that you see in both Celtic and certainly a lot of Viking Age Scandinavian art as well. But when we're looking at this piece, the first thing I think, I'm like, well, it's kind of cool, but it's got a lot going on. I hope we aren't having to fill the background on everything on these, just because I'm a little concerned about how much we're doing on some of the pieces, especially because what are they running these on? So we're looking at this piece, and I also know that I'm going to have to add text to this before it goes up. It's not just going to be this. They want text above or below. And in this case, we are going on unstructured hats. So we are talking about the least structured dad hat you can imagine. So when I'm looking at this piece, I'm like, all right, we're in unstructured hat territory. I'm going to have to stabilize pretty well. I'm going to have to work on this piece and make sure it runs. And we're working on hats in general, which means that I'm going to have to kind of work from the bottom up, center out. We know that we're going to have some issues here. Plus, looking at the sizing, now I know unstructured hat, that's got a very small vertical amount of space I can work on before I'm getting up into the crown or I'm having difficulties. If it's a single color design, maybe I go way up into the crown. I don't mind too much. It's a little bit of distortion, won't kill me. On a design like this, where I have pieces that they want outlined, where they want these to stand off, and what ends up happening also is they say, we don't want the background. However, we want lots of outlining because we're going to be running on a bunch of different colors. So the design brief is a little difficult. We're running on something that's not really friendly. We are running a design that's got lots of detail work in it. and we are running at an extremely small size. This is where we have to start getting back into communication, right? So, what ends up happening with this piece? We'll talk about it. Number one, I'm just going to tell you I had to make alterations to the art before we ever started. I'm going to have to take a little chance at the art first. Most of the time, you might see somebody work on these pieces and they might not, go straight to that. But for me, I was like, they've got vector, so I'm not going to have to redraw it. But I do want to show them a little bit of what it's going to be like if I reduce the detail down to a point where it'll work for them. Plus, I know they want text above and below. Let me give them a version in vector that's much more likely to work and see how much I can take out before it becomes problematic for them. And in that case, I ended up, because honestly, I did the redraws on all of this. This isn't something that I sent to the art department. I just handled it. And by the way, the rendition on this is not perfect. I did not go to the point of making it exactly like the embroidery. I told them that this was a rendition that was simpler, that was much more like how the embroidery would turn out. And this is what I ended up with at first. I said, all right, let's work on this. We're going to thicken up some outlines. I'm outlining everything so we can see it. We are increasing the size of these little triquetra on the corner because they were important to them, but we're dropping out the central lines. These pieces are going to be very small. We're talking about probably sub 2 millimeters, dropping a bunch of lines on the top of them and having to change color, trying to get especially on an unstructured dad hat, trying to drop central contrasting color stitch lines in the middle of all these satin stitches. The likelihood of it falling to one side or the other or being off center is incredibly high. And especially inside of the little triquetra, the little triangle knots in the corner, almost impossible to imagine it's going to look any kind of good, right? We're not going to get something we want out of it. Also, we have to get the space for this lettering, and this particular lettering, which is kind of an unseal style lettering. It's a very, classic Irish style lettering. It's a manuscript unseal. This has these really small apertures and small things and tall L, and all of these things are going to have to be kind of worked with because they're going to bite into our vertical space. But you can see if we went back and forth between the two, and I'll see if I can go back and forth between the two in an elegant way. There are fewer stripes in the shirt down here. There are thicker outlines in general. We've dropped those excess line art pieces that are in this. We've had fewer checkers in the shirt that's up top here as well. We've reduced a lot of the detail and we've made it just a little simpler. If we go back to the original, we can see we've got these big open eyes. Also, color inside the eyes is just not likely to happen at this size. We're just beyond that. So central lines are not going to be there. Some of the finer lines on this piece are gone, and some of the outlines and details have to be thicker for it to run. So there's what they brought us, and this is what we ended up showing them as an intermediate step. This is why I talk about doing a 3-stage art approval when there's a lot of changes. Sometimes it can be very useful, especially if the logo is already in vector, so we're not going to be redoing it, to have them work on this piece with you and say, here's what it's going to look like. Here's the final layout. Here's where the text is going to go. And we think this is going to work, but it's probably going to have even more consideration given to alterations once we get on the machine. But this is what we think is more likely to happen. Are you going to sign off on that or not? If this is absolutely not good for you, we need to talk about some other proposition to make this more interesting. And I'll say this, actually, at the age I am now and what I would do now, I probably would actually look at this piece and say, can we do something interesting with the two heads? Can we do something where we have them both blowing horns, doing a wide, narrow format or a wide, short format on the hat? Can we do something with just the text and then some element of this, 2 crossed horns? Is there something else we can do to make it even bigger so it's more visible? Because I will tell you that once this piece was run on the hats, it's very small and it can get a little, like I say, it's like a hamburger. We can see that there's a burger there. We're not looking at the individual grounds anymore. I think sometimes that can be a little busy and a little tight. But we'll talk about it, right? I think that it turns out all right, but I will show you a little bit more of the kind of problems that we encountered, and we'll show you the actual design. Now, this is, of course, just a digital rendition. I'll zoom in and show you some of the things that happened to the design so we can discuss how that turned out. So this is the actual design that ended up happening. So this is the stitch file. This is not the original, so we're going to look at it from the stitch file perspective. I'm not going to be able to show you all the objects that were in here, which is fine, because we don't need to see the objects. All we have are the color breakdowns and the different pieces. But I am going to run you through it to show you some things and show you how it ran. First thing to notice, yeah, we have most things outlined. Well, why do we have most things outlined? Because we really are going on lights and darks. So we're going to be on all sorts of different colors on these hats. The other thing that you can't quite see here is we actually had 2 colors of yellow. It's really not showing that well. But yeah, postage stamp size. Yeah, you're pretty right, Cindy. This one's a little larger than that. Total height on this guy is about 63 mils. So, it's not incredibly small because we had to go pretty big, but that's 63 mils going up to the top of the L and down to the bottom of the A that's sticking out here. So the actual design area itself, we did everything except for the texting here. The selected amount that we have here is like 57 mils tall. So, we're right around the minimums that we're usually seeing for a hat. So pretty small sizing. We tried to crank it a little smaller, but as you can see, if we're looking at this 1-to-1 on screen, and I mean, you guys aren't sitting in front of it, but you can kind of see because of these are centimeter blocks that you're seeing behind you. It's pretty small. I mean, we'll swap it to inches for those of you who haven't seen it. And it's, like I said, 2.5, but that's up to and including the edges of the text. And it's not quite 2.5. So we're pretty small. It's not tiny, but it's not huge. And especially if we start thinking about all the detail that we have in these faces. We did have to remove some stuff. The idea of trying to zero another outline or another doubled line of color in straight stitch inside of this piece just isn't very likely. And especially we're talking about trying to drop other outlines around the rest of the piece. Now, what we will see, lots of the pieces are outlined. We've got some straight stitch outlining being used for most of it. So we do have straight stitch for that second color around these hats. We are using straight stitch for the second color around this hat as well. Most of that is going on, but we did catch some of the little details on the horns. We did catch these little lines. As you can see, when I'm in stitch base mode here, or when you're in line mode, they are attached to the outside of that horn edge. They come in with the outline. There's nothing wrong with that. It's okay for those to be attached. At that size, you can't tell. We did get these swirls in the knees and the elbows. Those things are there. They exist. But if we're looking at this thing overall, we have way fewer stripes in the body. We have way fewer checks in the body here. And the eyes are the ones I've shown you when we talk about sampling and testing. We've got diamond eyes. Little diamonds that are open. They're larger than they would be on the original piece, just so that when we're at size, we get these little open diamonds. We get a little bit of a show that there is an open eye there instead of trying to make it entirely closed. It would be a line. You go much smaller than this, and you're going to have a line across and back, and there really won't be much more. Other things of note that are kind of interesting, if we look at this, the shoes are carved out of multiple satin stitches, so we have a little definition there. Rather than trying to draw outlines in or make those have more detail, you can see, and we'll zoom in on them, we actually have 3 satin stitches coming together to make each of these shoes with a turning satin on the bottom. And so we get a little bit of texture and they look a little bit more realistic. You're also going to see that the legs are individual satin stitches, so that this leg has a stitch angle that's different from the leg underneath it. So this piece looks carved. And as I run through it in a second here, you're going to see the carving style look to it before the color goes on. You're going to see that there's some definition to the legs that is owing to the fact that I used turning stitches and kind of carving. But once again, we look at this and we compare it to the original art. The original art was a lot busier, had a lot going on. There was more in here. There was also facial expressions to some degree. We see the mouths on the beards and all that, and we don't have a ton of that left by the time we get here. We're insinuating that it's there, but we're not worrying too much that it's not there because it's just a little too small to show. But let's go ahead and run through it. And like I said, is this my best design ever? No, you can probably find stuff in it. I know while we're running through it, I'll find stuff in it that I don't like, but we're going to talk about some of the technical things I did to make it work. Number one, because this thing was going on such a very soft hat, you'll see that I'm doing some underlay that is literally just meant to tack the hat down long enough. It was tacking the crown down to the stabilizer long enough for me to get to the other sections and run them. Also, something I think I said earlier, there's actually 2 yellows. It's not showing great in the preview. There's a gold and a yellow, and they were adamant that there was a gold and a lemon yellow. So you have to realize that though it looks like I've got some extra color changing and stuff going on, this is actually 2 different colors. It's a gold and then a much more lemony yellow on top of it. So they were not intended to be the same thing. So first, you see there's some details that are going in, but you see all this underlay that is just holding down the cap. So we've got the bangles on the hats. We've got the horns running in there first because we're going to have other colors that I want to sequence in later that go over the top of these and are outlined on them. So I decided just to do all of this color as much as I could. And then I centered out the outline. So you're going to see that I go center out, bottom up on the outline. It still takes a little bit of work to get it to work right, but this was the only way that I could really get everything to hold down and work in the way that I wanted to. And I'll show you another one that I've shown you guys before. Quarter Celtic, another Celtic one where the outlining is so intense that when you work on the piece, you have to split them in weird ways. depending on the kind of hat you're running on, if there's a lot of distortion to keep them together. This one, the colors all ran together. I didn't have to fully split it in half like I did with Quarter Celtic, but I did have to do a lot of underlayment that was meant just to hold stuff down. And now you can see I've got the very technical kind of interlace that I tend to do, where I try and make things as realistically interlaced as possible, even though you'll see that I didn't do a perfect job. Then we're getting on to our other color of gold here, and I'm running the rest of these pieces in. Then we've got outlining. Because we are dealing with this thing shifting so much in the hoop, these extremely soft hats, I outlined after the fact of the initial color, which means I'm going to revisit the black a few times in this piece, more than I usually would, because the shifting was making that really fine outline not want to hit exactly where I want it to be. Then we see the two faces run together. This is mostly just done for efficiency's sake. I'm trying not to change colors any more than I have to. But then we get the green base. So the other thing you're going to find is I used a green base underneath most of the kind of shirts. The other satin stitches that make the stripes and that make the checks run on top of it, when we're this small and it's just satin on satin, I see more difficulties coming from cutting out every little area underneath the stripes, every little area underneath the checks than I get anything out of it. Like, as long as my pull compensation is good enough and I'm watching my stitch angles and I'm actually just compensating for how much it's going to sink into the satins below, it's actually a little happier just to put underlay on it and run those satins on top. And you find out that you can get a pretty good quality out of it, and you're pretty happy with that final result. So here comes the arms and legs. So here's that first arm. Then we have that leg with that little piece cut out. But you can see the back leg is behind the front leg. That's very thoughtfully done. The concept is to make it look like they're dimensional, and the leg that's closest to us is on top of all of them. You start to see how that's carved out. And then we see our shoulder. And of course, in this case, we got the first hat here before we do the outlining. So now we go back to the blue. We have the second hat, and then we can use the blue to do the outlining and detail work. So there's the hands. We start doing outlining and detail as we go. And this just travels on in one unbroken path. So outlining, and then back to where we started, all the way back around. Now we've got the orange for the beard and hair on the lower person, and then we can get into the shoes. Unfortunately, there's just some jumping around that had to happen for these shoes to be on top of the legs the way I wanted it to be, and we had to visit the beard on top of the facial fill. Then we start doing detail work. We've got some black detail work in here for our guy on top. He has his face outlined. We do some red detail work on the hat over here, and then we get into text. And in this case, I'm going to tell you, this text was done left to right. This is just something that probably should have been centered out, tell you the truth. It ran all right because once everything was so stabilized and sewn down, it was fine. After we ran it, I just stuck with it. When we did later runs of this piece, I did center out this text, but the first time I did it, I didn't. I just did bottom and top. And frankly, once this was all sewn down, I didn't have trouble with it. It was already sewn in. Everything was attached, and I had done the tablecloth method ahead of time. Is that the best way to do the text? I probably should have still centered that out. It wouldn't have hurt it very much for me to center that piece out. But in the first case of the initial samples, I ran it like that. It ran well, and the truth of the matter was, it was approved and run partially in absentia. This is one where the operators ran it. They ran the sample up to sales. Sales said, good to go, and sales ran it. I didn't actually get to verify this one. That was something that in my later career, I complained about a lot more. In this initial company, I wasn't quite as involved in that stuff, and I didn't get to have all of the approval time. But yeah, Doug says, why not the text first? Because we'll freeze all that material in the middle, and we'll get a bubble. Sometimes you can. You could do the bottom text first. Originally, the other thing is we had two versions, one without text, one with, so I dropped the text after. You could do the bottom text first. You're just adding another color change. That's all that really matters for that, is that you'd be a little less efficient with the color change. In this case, I did the text after. I probably these days would do bottom text first and center out. It just depends. In this case, I was more concerned about getting the underlay in the center. Plus, I really want to work from the center out as much as I can. As you can see, I really am trying to get that center locked out and get all these outlines done. And when I was running the text first, the first couple times that I did a piece like this where I've run text and then run into the center again, as I push toward the stitch down text, certainly you get kind of bubbling. And as I'm going all over the place, up, down, left, right, you can get where a ripple will get pinned to the existing text. It'll kind of move it across. The other thing I would say I would do in a modern sense, since this is many, many years ago, before we had a lot of materials, you have to realize this is in an era where the nice machines we were running were 9 needles and were not all that nicely maintained. Like the new machines were 9 needles, and the old machines we were still running at the time of this piece being done were 6 needle Tajimas, which were very, very old. So this is early enough that I'm running on some pretty archaic hardware. And I'll say this too: we didn't use a lot of spray adhesives or different. This is in an era of you got two kinds of stabilizer, cut and tear. What do you want? All of them white. And so this is not run in an ideal condition. And I'll say that's true. But yeah, if I were doing it now, I probably would. Yeah, bottom text first, probably center that text out. But this does run. It runs okay. It runs on those hats. And I'll say the biggest important thing you can take away from this on a technical basis is that I still do structural underlay, not exactly like this. And in fact, I probably would have started the underlay in the center and traveled out down to that horn first instead of going bottom up in this case. I probably would have gone bottom up to a degree and then done a little more underlay before I started running those satins. Because that central underlay right there, I've got a danger of puckering in here a little bit if I don't watch it. I probably would have come up from the center and then worked a little bit out left, a little bit out right, and then came back and did all the rest as travel. The only thing you have to worry about is with really thin outlines like we have here, you can't travel under them too many times, because the more times you travel, you're building up thickness. And if you travel a ton of times underneath it, eventually the text or the underlay will pop out of each side of that piece. Like I said, is this the most fantastic piece I've ever made? No. Have I improved since then? Absolutely. But I should hope all of us improve over, 17, 18 years. I should hope you improve. So this is one of my earlier designs. I don't think I've improved probably enough. I'll say that. I probably am not working enough because I need to be improving more than I have been. But it is interesting to see kind of this transition where we start from an original piece of art that's kind of wonky, not the best, but it's interesting. It's got some interesting stuff going on, but we can tell immediately that it's not really well suited for everything. We move on to providing some different opportunities and say, this is what we can do. I think we could have done something even more interesting now if we had said, this is really cool for your signage, and I love what you're doing here. But if these two people are important, we could do busts of these two people. We could have them facing each other and crossing horns and do some interlace and get the text really big. We could do top and bottom rockers on that and have this thing really take up 4 inches wide and get more design out of it. But I'm also going to say sometimes you'll find the other thing being that it's a design issue as far as how they want to present themselves. And sometimes what it is like, this is a high-end place. It caters to people who are probably going back and forth to their golf game rather than, going back and forth to, let's say, anything less savory. These are people who want a low-profile, expensive golf hat that's Nike style. They probably don't want a trucker or my big patch hat, though I think that may have changed by now. But like I said, many years ago, very different kind of look. And I'll say absolutely not my best work. I see things that make me cringe in here pretty badly. There's some sequencing issues that I don't love. And like I went from the top tri-catcher on the top here down to this bottom corner in a jump. And I feel nasty about that. I don't love how it turned out. But at the same time, I know that it stitched all right, but it did cause problems. This is not my first version. This was the 6th edit because we had a lot of things going weird. And I'm going to say, whether this was the machine itself, so technical issues on the machine, or problems with the hat drifting and the sequencing, you're also going to notice this right-hand column is a little more compensated to the right than the left, which is not the case over here. That just turned out to be necessary. The design, the sequence, the way this thing was running after the first couple samples I did. Now, some of the versions were me going back and forth on the art, talking to the customer and seeing what they were happy with. But the other versions that happened at the end were because I was not getting a good outline and it was drifting in. We were getting some compression in the art and it was drifting in on the right-hand side. And once I did a little bit of adjustment, you'll see that there's a little more compensation out toward this right side, especially on that column. Just had to be that way. One of the things you have to do is trust that the machine is telling you what it needs to tell you. If your machine is consistently coming back after your sample and you've got something that's a little weird with that column, even if it's not the same on the other side, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. The stresses that you're putting things under might just have that be the case. So we went kind of heavy on that one. I'll try and go a little lower on the other ones. I'll just show you a couple different things and we'll go pretty quickly. But I will run you through that quarter Celtic hat. I wanted to show you that one again. If I can show you that, and let's go ahead and show you the actual finished piece. This is that finished piece. This was a very similar thing. I think it's a lot more refined piece, maybe a little simpler, but a more refined piece from later in my career. And just to show you what I mean by that splitting, this one was so difficult to get right on the kind of hats they wanted. Funny enough, it was the structure was causing problems. It was flagging a lot. It was pushing down. That I actually split it into two pieces where we did the colors separate. We did the underlying coloring and then the outline on each side as its own piece. And this is the only way that I could make this reliably on these kind of really heavily structured old school truckers that they had. They did not want to run any other way. So very much centered out, much more like I would do things now. As you can see, lots of comp on these because these little outlines were pulling in quite a bit. But that's the thing. Every hat is different. Every design is different. Every sequence is different. Let's show you a couple more that were fun before we get done with this today. We'll just do a couple more quick ones. One of them was the folks from Acoma Sky City, so the Pueblo of Acoma. I've done a lot of Native American seals, certainly things that were done for tribal bureaus, tribal police, different tribal groups, and they often have lots of detail. And the problem I was actually having was an art problem, mostly because what it turned out was all the different divisions I was dealing with all had a different version of the Great Seal, and the art wasn't the same. And every time I was given a new sample, they were very, very different. And we were dealing with very widely different scales as well. And so this is something where I'm just kind of showing you that this can happen where you just have to go with the flow and find out what people want. And the difficulty is on my end because I couldn't reuse art. I couldn't really reuse elements. I had to keep on reproducing. And this is, by the way, some of the nicer art I ever had is somebody finally gave me an example patch that they had produced elsewhere because it at least had more to do with what the design looked like to them, but they were all different and had different icons. But let me show you this piece. So this is the piece I'm talking about. This is the Pueblo of Acoma Sky City, and this is one of the police badges. Let me tell you, this thing is big. This is really like a 4.5-inch circle. It is a big patch. But on it, as you can see, there's all the different little icons that are there. And we have some interesting textured native band designs. We have kind of this rainbow design here, which, by the way, the colors in this shifted wildly from group to group. And the order of the colors shifted from group to group. But we have these individual pieces where we have the pottery that's down here, which changed wildly from piece to piece. And we have the birds that are here. We have the cloud with the with some rain. We have the actual Pueblo outline and silhouette. And we have like the corn stalks that are here. All of these different items have to be there. And obviously they're important. I mean, these are culturally important touchstones. They're all in this Great Seal. I can't exactly go without them. So when we had to go smaller, left chests and hats really got pretty tight. And we had to really work. As I told you earlier, we're talking about an era of 6 and 9 needle machines being what I had to work on. 6 and 9 needle machine, you're not rethreading in the middle of that to do all these pieces. You're trying to make it all happen in 9 colors and be as considerate as you can be to make this happen. So let me just show you a couple of pieces I worked on. And like I said, early pieces of mine. So I know they're not the best. And I'm going to tell you the art, this is clearer than the art I was given by a mile. The art that I was originally given was not as good as this. This is later on, I found this piece and went, oh man, my stuff didn't look like this at all. And I hope it's okay. But we had some interesting detail. And I'm going to show you, I actually had 2 different sizes of it. And I was working from some example pieces. So I had a jacket back and a left chest. And I'm going to be honest with you that my detail is not much more than this. There is not a bunch of crazy great detail because one of the things that happens, we talk about artwork and expectations, and I'll go ahead and kind of bring myself up and discuss this for a second. When you're talking about art versus expectations, one of the other things that can happen is the art just doesn't have the information in it. You can't do more than the art has to a degree. Yes, you can put more in. I've often taught you guys how to put more detail into something as far as textures that are interesting. Maybe you look for example art, but in a commercial context, making this patch where we have so many icons, I'm not going to go back to photorealistic representations of each of these animals and try and find an angle and draw each one of them again for a job like this. The truth of the matter is it just is not tenable. You can't have that be commercially successful unless somebody's paying a tremendous amount of money. And when we're just reproducing existing pieces and trying to get maybe a little better quality wise, the chances of me redrawing all of these or going back to source art, or especially when the source art wasn't available, we didn't have an online version that was decent. We didn't have anything. They couldn't bring me a hard copy that looked great. And then the other problem being is when we did get hard copies or we looked at our other files to try and find something that was viable from their print work, you would show it to somebody, and depending on where they were from or which division they were in, they're like, no, I want to match what we already have. I don't want to match the art from that other group. This one is more accurate for us. And we had that problem. And so what did it actually end up being really? Yes, there's some design issues. Yes, there's some technical issues with like how many colors we had to deal with and all the color changes and trims, which were unavoidable on a piece that has multiple icons like this. But a lot of it really is just communication and making sure expectations are there. Um, Not technical difficulties. This is embroidery. It's fine. There's not much there that's going to cause much trouble aside from some fine outlining and a little bit of detail. However, you do have to make different decisions for different scales. And you did have to deal with art. You have to deal with the expectations and say, hey, this is what art we have. Are you good with this? Is this what you want? And then if you go on your own searching for art, you have to realize sometimes, yeah, I find a more high resolution source, but it's not what the customer actually wants. And this is one of those ones that taught me to be more cognizant of what the customer's looking for rather than what I think they need. You have to actually find what it is they're looking to do. So let's go ahead and do a little review of a couple of the pieces I did for them. And the colors are not perfect on these, but I'm going to go ahead and just show them to you anyway. And you can see kind of what I'm talking about. The art's very different. So this is one of them I did, and this is more of a left chest size piece. It's still really big for a left chest size piece. So left chest on jackets, we're still dealing with something that's 4 inches. We're really a pretty big piece here. But when we're dealing with all this text, all these details, and as you zoom in, you'll see I've got maybe a little more detail on some of my pieces. Certainly, our bear friend looks a little funny. We could have done some more for him. I honestly didn't have enough to work from for a lot of these. And something else I'm going to tell you now, I didn't change it much on this piece. What the art that I was brought on some of these, there was a very different level of detail and finish on each of the icons. So I couldn't find, unfortunately, the original art for this piece. But looking at some of those pieces, you'll see that there just really wasn't much I could go from. I did do some changes. If we look at this piece, you'll see, or at least you'll see some things that are different on mine than theirs, or than the police one. You're also going to notice that some of the order is not exactly quite the same. Some of the alignments aren't the same, and certainly some of the positions and the way that the animals were represented, or the way that some of these plants were represented, just aren't quite the same. But you can see that it's a very similar look. But I'm dealing with the art that I have. The expectation is I'm going to represent the art that I have, and honestly, some of it's very different. The placement of the pot, if you see the placement and the sizing of the pot and the other icons around it, very different look when we come to this one. And we do have a little more detail in the pot. Also, they did different colors. They had a lighter color on top of here instead of a darker color, which changed for the jacket back version, by the way. And we can see we've got a little more detail in the pumpkin. We don't have any foliage underneath it. You can still see, though, that despite the fact that the detail was really low, I couldn't help myself by doing a little bit of work that is like the way I do things. In the Pueblo, I made sure that this area that was the closest to us, this kind of mountain edge, the edge of the mesa, looks a little different. It's a satin stitch that's on top of a fill. And then you see that as the Pueblo recedes back, that I actually used some different satin stitches to get some more detail in there. I've got some rough satins to kind of do the smoke out of the top. And you can see that there are some texture changes I've tried to make. To make this little area of fill look a little more interesting and natural, I've used a randomized fill. So you can see that those points, the lengths are not exactly lining up. But when we zoom out, you can say, yeah, there are color changes galore in this piece. Absolutely there are, because there just wasn't much I could do to save that. I can't travel between these. So there's color changes, there's jumps, there's lots of trimming that has to happen. And honestly, only in pieces like on the left-hand side here do we have good traveling where we're not, making kind of a hash of it. And you can see as we're traveling through, I'm using traveling stitches, I'm hiding things, but as I go through, I'm trying to also reduce the number of color changes. And when I do that, that means there's going to be some jumping, and I'm not going to be able to just trim in between them each time very simply. Other things to kind of look for, you can also see this, where that detail is on the edge of the fill. There's lots of people who will bring in, if they had a vector piece that had some hashing or something on the back of it, they want to think of this as one unit. Very obviously, if you've got those little thin lines, I've done the thin lines as manual running stitch before I go ahead and get into the fill on top. And I've used a jagged edge on that fill to blend that in a little bit nicer. Is that ideal? Is it the perfect detail? No, this is a pretty rough looking design. I'm not going to lie to you. At the same time, we do have some technique stuff that is interesting. We've got some texture that's been done in here. We have some texture in here. You can see that I'm using some detail with fill over. We can see that I've got some outlining, but that we still have some carving down here with this oak and the leaves. That there is still some of the hallmarks of more detailed work, even if we didn't have the most detailed art in the first place, right? And we are doing careful pathing so that we don't jump and trim just anywhere. But this is a design that has a lot of details in it. And honestly, the art that I started from, Mr. Bear over here looked like this. Is this the best rendition of Mr. Bear? Absolutely not. If I were going to do it again today, I'd probably at the very least split the neck off from the head, and I'd want to have some sort of detail in the eyes and nose. But it wasn't in the original, and it wasn't something that they really wanted to add it. Also, it drove me mad. These are not even. The rainbow stripes aren't even. They weren't even on the original. I tried to just reproduce it as best I could. It was not a great look. If I were doing this again, I'd probably kind of force my hand and try and get these a little more even, but this did reproduce the patch they had. And then we also have, here's a larger example. We have this jacket back piece. You can see I did try, even though I was working from mostly the same art. If we go back to the choices that were made here, and by the way, color changes on this one. The colors did change between these two as well. But we're going to see that, there's just not as much detail in the pronghorn. You get in here and we're working at a jacket back size and we can do that. Now our pronghorn has details. Now I can work on the piece and I'm looking at some of the other art sources and I'm doing a better job of it. Did I go full carving on the eagle? No, I did go randomized fill and I did do randomized fill, curved fill to get a little bit more detail out of it. Our bear, instead of having just solid shading, I've got eyes that are separate from the shading and a little bit more shading done in it. Could I have done a little bit more of that on the small size? Maybe. But if we look at this piece, the little bear himself is not very large. We're only dealing with, sub an inch. It's a little bitty bear. Could I have put some more detail in it? Yes. I also, to be quite honest with you, weren't being paid for making each one of these into a photorealistic rendition, and it wouldn't have looked like the art. But you will see corn on the cob does have a textured fill in it, and it has the grid drawn on it that shows kind of the individual kernels. And the big one, the pot, this one really does, because it's a really critical thing that's right in the center and has a lot of detail work on it. At the jacket back size, I did a lot of manual stitching. And you can see unsupported manual satins, but to get those little corners to line up just right and to do that pattern, using a satin stitch tool and trying to have it generate those stitches at size exactly and land right where I wanted to just was not working. Satin stitch blocks that come down to a point wasn't working. I wanted to be able to turn out and really control my stitch lengths. Are some of them pretty small? Yes, but when this runs, you get that half diamond pattern on that pottery in a way that you wouldn't get if you didn't use manual stitching. So once again, is it the most beautiful piece I've ever done? No. Did I do some things to make it good? We can see there's some of these jumps didn't show up right on the preview, but we've got some carving in the satin stitches on our little parrot here. We have multiple angles of fill and overlapping with some rough textures over here. We have a little bit of carving in this bird as well. We have tried to make some things happen. We've done some shading. We've got, a couple of satin stitches for our pronghorns. We have a 2 satin stitch beak so that we have a little bit of upper and lower light differential between the two. And we do have a little bit less, honestly, detail here in the Pueblo, but that also turns out they didn't want quite as much detail as big wide satins would have done for that. They wanted it to be a silhouette. So I honored that wish and I only did satins and a little bit of a break here to show the difference between the Mesa and the Pueblo. It's all about honoring customer requests and working with what's there. Is it ideal? No, but I mean, it is what we had for art and it's what we had for time. And we did do some work. We carved our pumpkin. We've got overlapping satins for that, so it's nice and textury. It looks nice. We've used a split satin or a length limit stitch in the rainbow panels so that we still get the lovely turning satin that it looks like both from this sample. And if we look at the way that all of the other samples are done, they have turning stitches done in here instead of fills. Lovely. Now, what I'll say is when I finally got this sample, I was just a little floored and unhappy because I wish I would have seen that this was textured so it looked like weaving. Over here on the left-hand side in that ribbon, that strap work, I absolutely would have done that on my own piece if that's what the art had looked like. But looking at the original samples, we had pictures of embroidery and not much else. And we had some original print art that was not of perhaps the best quality. We did what we could do. Once again, is this the best work I've ever done? No. Are there some details to make it look nice? Yes. Is there some carving, some texture? Pardon me, I'm having some issues with my Zoom right now. But yeah, there we go. It is something that you can do. You can do overlapping nicely. You can get nice turning satins. You can carve some leaves, carve the pumpkin up, do some shading, and make it at least interesting texturally. But yeah, sometimes you just have art that's not the best art or not congruous, doesn't work with what you're trying to do. And yeah, you're right, Ron. Could have used some randomness in Mr. Bear. Yeah, for sure. Probably should have used some more randomness in Mr. Bear. The little tiny version of Mr. Bear could have probably done with some. He actually is not random and probably should have been since some of the others were. But yeah, we matched that up, and definitely on the larger piece, I did use more interesting textures as far as trying to get that dealt with. But yeah, like I said, years and years ago, and not my best piece, and doing a lot more of matching what was already there. When we varied too much from what they had in their original stock of uniforming, they were not real happy. So I had to refine without completely altering the piece because they didn't want to have it look like one guy's wearing the old jacket, one guy's wearing the new jacket, and they didn't match. They really wanted it to kind of stay consistent. So like that, like I said, a little bit of work that we could put in, but not a ton. And texture, yeah, could have done some better texture work on that piece for sure. And believe me, it's very humbling to show you guys some of these samples. But hey, like I said, we're trying to talk about the reality of this, and this is from my early career. I feel like I've certainly gotten better, and I think if I did those now, they'd be much more refined. But at the same time, the other thing is I wouldn't have 9 colors to do all of those. I would have been able to do those with 15 colors, and I could have absolutely expanded what was possible. And especially if I didn't have somebody kind of telling me they didn't want to change the pieces, right? So that's kind of where we were. But let's go to the last piece that I was going to talk about today, and it was for a company. It doesn't exist anymore, so I don't feel too bad talking about their stuff. But this was brought to me for a jacket piece. It was done on some fairly light jackets. And once again, this is a problem where we're dealing with art that's not necessarily exactly all you'd want it to be. And this was a piece done for a company called Bugstop. And Bugstop brought in this art. Now, certainly this art is photographic. I'm going to tell you once again, we are dealing with a machine with 9 colors on it. We are not going to do this thing in 15 colors. So I'm going to let you know now that we're going to have to be pretty reductive with what we managed to do with this piece. So not once again, not going to be probably the most photorealistic piece. Also, what I'm going to tell you is they've cut these pieces of art out from everywhere. So one of the things that I always worry about with art and expectations and design. So we're looking at a piece like this. Sometimes the art just doesn't, it looks like something to the person who knows what these things are supposed to be. They can fill in the details of what should be there versus what's there. Certainly, there's also the technical limitations I have of the color changes. I'm not going to have more than 9 color changes to work on it. And also, there might be some technical stuff because we're working on some light jackets and I can't go really hard at jamming layers and layers of thread. So with 9 colors to work with total, with art that is of widely varied quality, and I'm going to zoom in on some of this. The other problem being a design problem, the art itself, each one of these bugs is in a different style. Some of them are like clip art, cartoon. Some of them are somewhat illustrative. Some of them are photographic. So our central guy here is kind of photographic, right? That's not a cartoon. That's a picture of a dead bug. But if we go over here, number one, our swallowtail or what have you, our butterfly here is in real bad condition, right? This is the level of art we have. I don't have any originals, and this is in a day where I wasn't going to get anything better. So this is what we have for the rest of this guy's little body. It's not great. Then we go over here. This is an illustration. This is like a colored pencil illustration. And once again, our quality is extremely poor. I'm going to have to deal with what I can deal with. Maybe I'll look at some photographs if I can find them and see if I find anything better, but trying to get the positioning as well as understanding what the photograph looks like, who knows? Like I said, this guy, more detail, but I'm also not going to be able to do a tremendous amount of really light shading with the colors I have. We've got this guy up here. He's also probably more illustrative, but once again, he's got some shading in him. We're not going to get away with as many colors as I would like. And it's very much more like a colored pencil illustration than a real bug. This guy looks like he came from some vector art at some point. So this Luna moth here probably has some better art somewhere in the world, but we were not privy to that and didn't have time or wherewithal to replace all of it or rebuild it. And we can see also this butterfly as well, not in the best condition. So when I'm zooming in to try and figure out lines, I've got some hash, right? This is really pretty badly pixelated. We have a lot of kind of dithering and it's anti-alias like crazy. So going to be hard because we got a much higher resolution on our stick bug friend in the middle than we have on anybody else. And of course we have our dragonfly, similar kind of thing. This one looks like it may be an illustration. And once again, as we zoom in, instead of seeing lines, we're seeing pixels. This is the kind of thing you have to squint and imagine where those lines might be. So that's what we're working with. That's a lot of weird stuff that we have to put together. So the first thing we're kind of dealing with is just incongruity, right? The design itself is just incongruous. The stuff is not all the same kind of design work. So when I go to look at this piece, I'm going to be like, all right, I'm going to have to make it a little more congruous. I don't want to try and render one in a photographic way and then render another one like a cartoon. I'm going to have to try and be a little more close to the bone with that. Didn't do a perfect job of it, but I'm going to try and make this look like they belong together. Luckily, reducing them in detail to make them embroidery is going to help with that a little bit. But once again, is this my best work ever? Not exactly. I've got some of the pieces on there I'm proud of, but not all of them are fantastic. But I did do something that was pretty decent. So let's talk about it. Let's see what that piece looks like in the real world. But we'll go ahead and pull that down for a second. We'll grab our actual file and see, what we can see about it. Once again, is it perfect? No, I don't think it's perfect. There's some stuff that could be a lot better about it. There's some things I don't love, but overall, I thought we have to reduce the colors, we have to reduce the amount of shading, and we have to make all these pieces kind of look like they belong together in this jacket back spread. And so we end up with something like this. Now, I had the text off of it originally. I took the text off of it so that I could keep these people nameless, because I'm going to say something not very great about how the job ended up. But at the same time, they're not in business anymore, and whatever, water under the bridge. What I'm going to say is some of this wasn't incredibly detailed. We were doing this stuff, quick turnaround. They were doing a very small number of jackets, and we had some limitations. What I will say is we did render it pretty well, right? We took a lot of detail out. We weren't looking to get every color and everything in there, but we do have decent textures. We're using a lot of curved fills to get a little bit of shine on it. We didn't go through and do every little bit of shading. You can see the trims that are here. Some of these are ones that'd be a little less obvious on the piece or would have been trimmed out. But we did. I tried for some detail. You'll see that we do have manual shading done. We have some cells on the wings. We do have some color gradation. We have some feathered edges. But trying to get all of the color that was going to be there is probably not happening. We do have satin stitch carving in the body. And in fact, if I can zip this back, let me see if I can go ahead and give you guys a replay and find where our friend is here that we were working on. What you're going to see is there is satin stitch carving on the body, so that when we see this piece, the legs are going to look separate from the thorax. It's going to look separate from the head. We're going to have that abdomen is a different kind of stitch quality and texture. Going to look pretty good. Then we have curved fills for the wings. Could I have done more to the wings? Absolutely. Once again, you see that I've got some detail work that I did before putting in some curved fills. But what I will say is with this amount of detail work, I got something that looked pretty detailed, looked decent, was illustrative, and was fast enough to get this job out the door. Because once again, could I render each one of these photorealistically? I could. The customer was very much not paying for that. That is not what they were looking to do. So I have to make some considerations to what the machines can do, what I can do, and how these pieces are going to look. Could they be better? Absolutely. Could you, if they would have put them together from super photorealistic stock designs of each one instead of jumping through a bunch of, clip art and crapping it together? Yeah, sure. They just kind of stuck it all together and slapped it together on a white background and went for it. But yeah, very simple pieces. There are some, like I said, there's carving in some of them. You'll see that the wings are all separate and curved. You'll see that the bodies are carved from satins, and you'll see some textures that have been added and some outlining. But what I tried to do is this. I wanted a set of pieces that had uniform fine outlining that was of the same width. They all looked semi-graphical, so none of them were super cartoony. We didn't have thick outlines on some and thin outlines on others. And the level of color fidelity on all of them is pretty similar, right? And we do have some nice little shading. You'll see in the beetle here, there is some interesting stuff as far as the shading, because we do have, not only do we have the carving on, we have the carving all through the mandibles and through the legs, but we also have curved fills being used in different blocks and different curvatures for the body. And then we have a 2-layer partial density set of fills to get a slightly darker brown and then a lighter brown based on how much density we have there, as well as some gray shading on top with highlights. So is this piece the most photorealistic? No, it is not. Does it capture what was going on in there pretty well? I would say yes. And for light use on a jacket bag, pretty good. I don't love the stick bug. Stick bug does at least have some carving in it. There was too much of the one color of yellow, but what we can see is first that I did, because we were on a light jacket that was moving around, I did some shape underlay to hold that jacket around before we started going. We have a lined light jacket, very windbreaker-like, as I recall. And so in order to get that to run really nicely before I started putting all the heavier stitching down, I went ahead and ran a shape underlay underneath it first. And then we do have some carving with some auto splits as far as the back end. Auto splits are length limit. We do have carving in the legs and in the arms. And then we went ahead and went with this. I'm going to say, if I were going to do this again, in the sake of pathing, I was trying to make it efficient and ran those to the middle. I didn't see a bunch of puckering, but I probably would have thought about trying to do some other kind of travel or allowing myself a trim to run those wings toward the outside. because running toward existing embroidery is never a great bargain. That's not what you're looking for. But all the little carving pieces on this means that though I'm not putting this ton of detail and shading in, when this piece is viewed, the light plays across that thread and it gives it the most chance of looking more realistic and dimensional without adding more shading or without trying to do excess, labor on it. I added some nice brown shading in the central area here, just some standard fill stuff, like half density fills. Some of it done, as you can see, it was kind of manually added though, but just to kind of tone that area down. Then some manual kind of zigzagging shading that's going on around the head. And then we went ahead and got this more solid shading and the outlines for the rest of the bug. So once again, are they the best? No. Are there some things I would change? I would say one thing I would change, I've got too much detail work going on inside of this bug, and so it got a little crowded and it got too dark. The values were a little too dark because I put too much detail inside of this one. I wasn't being as cognizant of scale as I probably should have been. And of course, if I were doing this with 15 colors and with more time on my hands, I would absolutely render these in more detail. I would probably put some more photorealistic detail and some shading. Too much yellow in our main bug here. The wings could have some more going on. But if we look at the original art, yes, there's some shading in them. But because I decided to do these as an outline style, so they all had that very graphic kind of, it was almost a pen and ink style that I went for to make them all similar and the same, and also to offset them from multiple colors. I think that the overall end result is pretty good. It's not the worst. Is it my best piece? No, but it's a pretty good piece. The things that I think were achieved here that are good is that the style looks uniform. Nothing looks out of place here. We did manage to recapture enough detail that all of these things are identifiable as what they're supposed to be, and they look all right. Like I said, they run good. They look all right. They're great on the jacket. Here's where the not so nice thing gets said. Here's where we have the other kind of interpersonal problem. The big sad thing about this jacket order is that despite having the order done and everything ready and ready for approval, these folks skipped on the order. So we can talk about all the work I probably should have done, but I'm kind of glad I didn't go to any more extremes for it because in the end, as I recall, I think these folks skipped on the order or they skipped on some portion of the order. And we ended up where one of the samples I had from this piece I had because it laid there in the pickup room and didn't get dealt with. I think it was the original, but I could have sworn it was the original sample that was there to be picked up and checked out and verified, and that they skipped on the order entirely. So honestly, some of that might be expectation. I know we had art that was kind of crazy and they might have wanted more out of that. Certainly part of the issue too was that we didn't have one nice piece that I was going to reproduce. We had 7 bugs that were very different, all from kind of poor art. And at the time, I didn't have quite as much control over the art and approval process as I did later on in my career. So it's one of those things where these things happen. Eventually you do have people who skip out, but I think it's pretty decent, right? Like I said, it is really hard to do, but you just have to get over these things. And one of the things I'm going to say about all this work, number one, I've just showed you some pieces I'm not the most proud of. Most of the pieces I show you, I try and show you some pretty interesting stuff that I'm proud of. I try and show you simple stuff too sometimes even just this text stuff. Though I'll say clean text that runs really well and resizes really well. That's actually sometimes more difficult than this stuff because I know I've got one size I have to hit, and if I can get it to run on that one garment and get it out the door, that's as good as I need to be as an in-house digitizer. It needs to run for the job that it was ordered for, and it needs to run at that size. Allowing somebody to do like I do with the texts that I've made, with the fonts I've made, where they're going to scale them to any size in the world, warp them all over the place, resize them, change stitch parameters, and they have to run pretty well. That's actually, I think that's a little more challenging to a degree. So I show you some of this stuff. But even showing you these pieces that are not my best pieces, not my masterpieces, I want you to see that because the reality of doing commercial digitizing, at least, is that a lot of your work is still pretty detailed. Most of the work that we did is simple. A lot of it is really logo work. It's stuff that it's not going to be necessarily that technically difficult. And most of your difficulties are in communication problems, are in interactions with fabrics that aren't working very well because we're working on fabric that's just very hard to embroider cleanly, are with people wanting text and details that are just too small, and we have to convince them that their best interests are not served by trying to force down to the smallest detail possible. So honestly, when I'm talking about digitizing difficulties and I show you these pieces, I'm just trying to show you a slice of this. And I think we're going to come back and do this again. I think this is something we can do other times where I just go back into the historical archives, the archive, the 16,000 plus designs I did commercially. And honestly, I've done many since, but this is when I was really just like my heels were dug in. I was doing commercial work. That was my primary function. And I think that's something that's interesting to talk about is like, it's a very different world than when you're making something artistically. A lot of the times I'm talking about the best ways to do embroidery and the things we can do to elevate it. You have to realize that sometimes things are like, I'll try and point with the proper hand here. I'm going to do it wrong. No, I got it. You see that little mobile logo there? That is just some satin stitch text. If we look at a lot of the pieces that are in here, satin stitch text with some swirls on it. I mean, sometimes we got some difficult stuff. Two-tone satin stitch text with a drop shadow that's here. We've got some logos down here. The CW logo is just a big piece of satins, but it has some small text, and it used to have a little tiny V that was embedded in it that got small. There's stuff that's interesting in each one of these, but some of them are very simple. But that's part of the work. Doing clean work quickly and dealing with really the interpersonal portion of it, the communication portion of it, can be some of the hardest stuff. I'm going to show you a last couple of ones just to show you something else that was an interesting technical challenge that happened. And I'm just going to show you something that caused me some difficulty, just to give you one more of these kind of concepts. So we did lots of those native pieces, and we'll finish out on this before I kind of give you some closing statements here, right? This is another piece I did. This is a left chest piece, and this little piece was done on low-profile hats, visors, everything you can imagine. But again, a fairly detailed piece. When we get zoomed in on it, what we have here is the eagle that is clutching the staffs, that has its little tail feathers here. We're working on this sunburst pattern, and you can see it's actually made of turning satin stitches, so that we have this very nice sunburst radiation of like the light across this piece travels very interestingly because each one of these is turning, right? But we do have this little kind of knockout at the bottom of each of these feather-like shapes that are in this kind of sunburst motif. We also have the stepped kind of, it's almost like native weaving patterns or pottery patterns that are here. And forgive me for not knowing exactly what everything should be called in this particular piece. However, if we look at this piece, got a lot of detail going in a small space. And then they actually requested a jacket back, and the jacket back they wanted to match didn't have a ton of detail on it, but we did add more. I did carve out some things. It was very flat. The original was incredibly flat, and I didn't want to change too much about it, but I did do turning fill stitches through here. You'll also see that the black actually runs underneath, and that stem of this kind of feather shape runs on top of it. And you'll also see that I've done some auto split satin work throughout as well. We've got some auto split satins done in the wings, so that we've got some nice overlapping satin stuff like that, so that it looks a little more interesting. But yeah, these are a couple of pieces that I had. The thing that might be interesting to look at as far as these two would be to look at the way this is constructed, and I'm going to show you something that can cause you problems. So let's first go ahead and run this out, and I'll just kind of show you how it's put together. First, you're going to notice that I've done a centered out full underlay for this piece. This was part of what I had to do in order to get this thing to stay stable and still get the kind of stitch angles that I wanted. One of the problems we had with this consistently, they wanted to run it on really highly contrasting garments. So a lot of black with this big white fill on it, with a lot of white detail work on it, that it was showing through on some of the garments, especially when they had texture. So something you had to work with is they really wanted a solid piece that didn't want to show through. I think if I was doing this again, I might even suggest to them that we applique white behind the whole thing. Because I think it would have been a softer piece and probably felt nicer and looked nicer with an applique badge behind it on some of these bigger pieces, especially the jacket back, because really trying to get that full coverage that they wanted and still run detail on top of it, which tends to split that fill a little bit, was difficult. The thing that I want to show you, though, is we've got this little central round that's in it. We have a little void, so there's the eagle with the carved tail feathers. Then we have our outer edge. And then each of these pieces, here's the thing to look at. You see how they're all connected to the outside edge by a little jump right there? And that they all run from the center out? This is by the time I've learned that if you run stuff toward the center of a design, it will start to pucker it. This one still wanted to dome and dish a little bit because most of the time I was probably running a little too much density. These are probably at 0.4 densities, but I would say when you look at, we've got these little carved satins that are all through the wings. It's a little too much. I think this was probably overworked a bit, and we have too many stitch penetrations on it toward the middle. The one great thing to take away from it is, though, learn to use your borders for travel, because you can travel around your edge, and I didn't have to disconnect that. That was one big connected piece, and I still used this center out kind of mentality that kept the design from puckering in or buckling too badly. I will, however, say that at the end of this piece, I think I could have done with a little bit different sequencing and certainly had worked with less density, because this one did want to buckle a little bit on some of them. The other thing that was a little difficult on this piece is to get the little white cutouts here. Trying to leave a gap when it was a double thickness of thread wide was not really tenable. So I had to jump in there and grab, really just put in some white detail work, and it's not ideal. So I would say it's not the best thing, but it worked pretty well. We had to add detail work after the fact, but this design ran pretty reliably. We ended up running it on everything. The thing to watch out for with designs like this that have a central area, sometimes you will need something like this, because if you run, especially if I were to run what seems very logical, which is to run the outside kind of teal edge first, this turquoise first, if you have a big gap in the center like that, there's really a chance for material to pop up or push up if it's not being stitched down or stuck down. So one of the reasons you're going to see designs that I've done where there is that kind of difficulty have this centered out fill style underlay for the whole thing is because I've got material that wants to push up, or because we're working on a lot of, sometimes we're working on things like performance wear where they really pucker up. In these cases, it makes a lot of sense to work in a different manner. But just wanted to kind of show you that method and say, yep, you got to work on that. But what I am going to say is watch how much density you're putting in. But remember the three-dimensional density, like I always tell you guys. In this case, we got a little too much overlap, and we have too many penetration points that are close together. Even though I liked the look of the carving in the silhouette sort of eagle that was here, it really could have benefited from a little bit of a lighter treatment. And even as we moved onto the jacket back, it wasn't too bad on the jacket back size. They kept it really simple like we did for some of the originals, but it still was just not probably everything I would have wanted it to be. I think that it could be done a little better. Certainly, I kept that graphical style instead of trying to go into something that was more realistic. And so I kept the big graphical elements and the big carved satins, and I did use curved fills in the head of the eagle. A lot of this is just about the detail not being there. But at the same time, I will say this piece still had those same problems where we had to be careful with the sequencing. And I did use an overall background. The other thing you'll see here too, because I used a turning stitch in that black, I actually made my own radial underlay. So that's just using a contour column stitch to make an underlay for that piece that was perpendicular to all the stitches. So yeah, interesting things that had to get done to get this thing to work from the center out before I bordered it up. But that's the thing, at different sizes on different materials, this was a multi-layer. I think it was a Coach style jacket that was very light and slippery. Light, slippery jackets with interlinings, things. I always think of them as windbreaker style, but they're not really windbreakers because the outside fabric on those ones was actually either a little more satiny. Some of them, we had some that were like poplin, but they were light jackets with an interior lining. Those things can be very shifty, and sometimes you have to do things with digitizing just to handle that stuff. So it just really depends, right? It's things to think about. Where are we going? What's happening? And then the holistic nature of the thing. As I say always with digitizing, the product of the digitizer is never the digitizing, it's the embroidery. And all of that has to come together to make that happen. So what does that all start with? Well, let's talk about this again. What are our difficulties? A lot of them are about communication. So we have to start with communication always. Get the best information from our clients, figure out what's important to them, and then be really clear about the environment that the embroidery lives in. What garment is it going on? What kind of contrast do we have? What is the design like? And what's possible at the size they want? And talk about art versus expectations. Sometimes we're going to have to change art. It's just a thing that has to get done. And then we start to work through things like technical difficulties. If we're having problems in the machine, the one great thing is the machine and the sample will tell you what's going on. Sometimes it can be hard to figure out. Don't get me wrong. There are times where we got thread breaks that don't make sense or the machine's doing something weird. But when we're talking about things like, especially we're talking about compensations or outlines going off, the amount that's going off, if it's regular from run to run, you do a couple sample runs and things are off, you can measure that and you can counteract it in the way you place your stitches on screen. Just understand that on-screen experience is not the one that we're really fighting for. We're fighting to get the actual piece done, and understand that you can correct. The sample will tell you what it needs. But the truth of the matter is, whether we're dealing with, communication issues, whether we're dealing with design issues, whether we're dealing with technical issues, a lot of what this is about us having the ability to hold on, to deal with the criticisms that come in, to deal with those difficulties and keep striving forward. One of the things I always say too is people say, kill your darlings. You can't hold on to any one of these designs and be too obsessed with it over time. When you're doing a commercial job like this, you do the design the best you can. You make the customer as happy as you can. You do the work to the utmost of the quality you can do, but you do it with the boundaries in place to know that you spend the amount of time that it's worth to you and to your company. You do the work, understanding what you're getting into. You talk to your client about what is really capable, what you're capable of, and what they can expect, and you let it go. Is everybody going to love everything you do? No, I've had people who didn't love everything I did. And I've had, the funny thing is too, I've had simple designs sometimes go off, whereas I've had great, super detailed, shaded designs go very well. And then watch a simple design for some reason that is either technical or has to do with interaction with the garment go astray. And I have to work on it more than I would work on that more complicated design. Um, these combinations change, but the good thing to understand is over a career, when you've done thousands of these things, yeah, you're going to have some hits and misses, but you do your best. You make sure you've listened and you do the job toward the goal of filling out that brief of saying, what is it you expect out of this embroidery? What are you trying to get? What's important to you? And you knock those things off. You check those boxes, do your best technical job, and then you let it go. Not everyone's going to be the best. Not every customer is going to stay forever. Not every piece is going to be an award winner or be on a magazine cover or be something that everybody is impressed by. Some of it is just good, solid work that we do so that people can identify themselves, identify who they belong to, and identify what is important to them as to what they put on their person. Some, in it's a business to business sense, sometimes it's just saying, I work here. And other times it's, I'm proud of being one of these people who belong to this group, who are part of this cause, who are in this team. We should take it seriously, but we also have to understand that each piece comes and goes. And that's just how it is, right? And honestly, the other thing is, we got Ron made a good comment here. He says, I don't love everything I do. Sometimes luck plays a part in the end result. And I'll say this too. Sometimes you make art and you didn't like the art ever. You weren't into it. It's not the kind of art you would ever do, but you do your best on it and you render it as faithfully as you can. But you do it with those boundaries firmly in place to say, you know, you're not going to be perfect. Thread is an interpretation. It is never the same as print. And that embroidery has to be done on its own terms to be the best embroidery it can be, not to be the most faithful representation of the print art that was given to you, even if the art, that's expecting that the art was good in the first place. So, you know, take some time, let yourself get out there, try some things out. By the way, there's some other questions here I'm going to answer real quickly as we get done here. Cindy says, do you just want to cry when you have a design like that? I had some where I gritted my teeth, especially when I had customers. The worst part was customers that I knew were difficult. I had lots of customers for different reasons, like some people who were scientists, some people who were engineers, some people who were in a field where they were very kind of intimately aware of the way an animal looked. And then I had to make something for those people. For the people who are very, very into the thing you're representing, it can be hard. Even sometimes classic car guys, people who are doing animal breeds. You guys know I've said that I never love doing those. When it's someone's personal show animal that they put all their time and love into and you're representing them and you're drawing it, that can be a very difficult thing. That made me cringe more than stuff that was really detailed. Though I have to admit, some of the really detailed stuff, it's hard when you are a digitizer and not the salesperson and maybe not the last decision maker, because there was a lot of stuff where what I knew was happening is we were not profitable, that somebody was bringing me what I always call an art project. Something that I could make it beautiful if I wanted to, but I'm going to be doing it on the company's dime because the job was not going to pay. There was no way. And sometimes you would find that the simpler designs were actually kind of supporting the people who had much more detailed designs. But yeah, didn't cry. And thank you, Cindy. You said that looks fantastic. I appreciate it. I think that one's not the best, but it was all right. Carol says, when Eric says pretty decent, that's going to be amazing. You know, I've seen so much amazing work out there. I'll say this. I'm not the best digitizer I know. I don't think so. There are people out there who have more artistic chops than I do, who maybe have a traditional artistic education. I don't have a fine arts education. I certainly would love to get more of it. And I've taught myself a lot and been in the space of doing a lot of design education on my own online. But I'm not a professional artist like some digitizers are. So I think probably my artistic interpretation is probably a little less than some. I'll say that I have a good balance between artistic interpretation and technical knowledge. The best things I do are very design oriented in a graphical way. I think that I do really nice text And I tend to do graphical pieces and logos in a way that's a little more interesting than many people will do. But the folks who do super painterly animals, I'm so impressed by those folks. Even though I can do a decent job of it, I always feel like there are some people who are just made for that stuff. And the people who paint with stitches by their very nature are probably a little different than me. I like very classic embroidery that uses the texture of thread to make the statement. People who are very painterly with their colors, I always am very impressed by. And those folks, I think, do different jobs than I do. And maybe I think of them as better, but they do a different kind of embroidery that they're very good at. But yeah, and Sydney, I agree. When they walked out on that design, that was a little heartbreaking because it was a pain. But that's the thing. We can't let that one job define our entire work load. And if I look back on it now, it's one in a sea of jobs that I did for people. And also, just because I have 16,000 designs, imagine how many variations were run on different garments in different orders. That's just the unique designs. It's crazy. There's lots of stuff where we got to do it multiple times for people, and people were happy. And I'll say, ultimately, for me, in the end, it's about two things. Are the people happy and feel represented by the thing that I've made for them? And secondly, are we making money? Because, hey, it's a commercial venture for me. It's what we did. I love doing the artistic side of it now more than I used to. But back in the day, it was keeping the needles moving. Is this thing efficient? And that's what I did love to do, is something that looked nice and had some interesting texture, but stayed efficient. All right, so get out there, guys. Go play. Do something interesting. Try stuff out. If anything, look at this and say, hey, just because somebody is in part of a point of authority where they're talking to you and telling you how they did it, it doesn't mean everything they did was perfect. It doesn't mean everything they did was also doesn't mean that their entire career from beginning to end looked like their best piece. Take that out of it, and also understand that you, like me, will be interacting with your designs in a way that's a conversation. This is not just you from on high. You will set up your design and make it run. You will work with that design. You will work with that art, and you'll live with it and come to a sort of sometimes an uneasy piece, but mostly an agreement where you represent it the best way you can with the tools that you have and make people as happy as you can and get that value back for yourself on the back end. All right, folks. So get out there, try some stuff, enjoy it, but let things go once in a while. They're not all going to be perfect, and be better than me about being angry about your perfectionism. All right, folks. With that, I'm going to let you go, and I can't wait to see you guys again next week.